May 2nd, 1982, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Commander Chris Wreford-Brown is standing in the control room of HMS Conqueror, and he has a choice to make. His submarine carries modern weapons, the Mark 24 Tigerfish, wire-guided, precision-engineered for 1980s warfare. He doesn't use them. Instead, he selects the Mark VIII Mod 4 torpedo, a weapon designed in the 1920s, entering service before the Second World War, built for a different age entirely. The reason is straightforward and brutal. The ship in his crosshairs is a 1930s warship, and a 1930s warship has 1930s armour. The Mark VIII carries a 365-kilogram Torpex warhead and runs straight. Against the Brooklyn-class hull ahead of him, it's the right weapon for the job. He fires 3 torpedoes from approximately 1,400 yards. 2 find their mark. 323 Argentine sailors die. The ship takes 49 minutes to sink from the moment of first impact, with the abandoned ship order given 22 minutes in. In a single afternoon, nearly half of every Argentine military death in the entire Falklands War, 49.77% of the 649 total, happens right here, in the South Atlantic, in cold water, in the space between lunch and dinner. The comment sections, 40 years later, still haven't settled this. Thatcher, the war criminal. She was exactly right. Doing so effectively prevented seaborne attacks. Both claims, one event. And you, right now, are the jury. This video won't tell you what to conclude. It will show you every exhibit, the prosecution's case, the defence's case, and the single most disorienting piece of testimony in this entire story. The verdict delivered by the commanding officer of the ship that was sunk. You'll hear what he said, then you'll make your own call. But first, you need to know what the target actually was. She wasn't born Argentine. The ship that Argentina called ARA General Belgrano began her life as USS Phoenix, hull classification CL-46, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser displacing over 12,000 tons, commissioned into the United States Navy in 1938. On December 7, 1941, she was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attack began. She survived it. While USS Arizona burned and USS Oklahoma capsized, Phoenix emerged from that morning without serious damage. She went on to fight across the Pacific and came home whole. The United States sold her to Argentina on April 9, 1951. She was renamed ARA General Belgrano in 1956. So what Wreford-Brown sank on May 2, 1982, was a Pearl Harbor survivor, a ship that had outlasted the Japanese Imperial Navy, outlasted the Cold War's early decades, outlasted multiple Argentine governments, sunk by a torpedo built in roughly the same decade she was. The weapons that killed her were almost as old as she was. 41 years of survival, ended by an artifact of the same era. That's the ship. Now here's the order. Margaret Thatcher convened her war cabinet at Chequers on the morning of May 2nd. Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, Chief of the Defence Staff, presented the operational case. The argument was direct. The Belgrano, wherever it sat relative to Britain's declared exclusion zone, remained a threat to the British task force. The rules of engagement in place at that moment didn't permit an attack outside the total exclusion zone, the 200 nautical mile boundary Britain had declared effective April 30th. Lewin asked for them to be changed. Thatcher authorised it personally. The order went to Conqueror. Wreford-Brown fired at 4 p.m. At 4:23, Captain Hector Bonzo gave the order to abandon ship. At 4:50, the Belgrano was gone. And at 5:44 p.m. Lima time that same evening, approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes after the torpedoes struck, Peru formally announced a peace proposal it had been developing to end the Falklands conflict. That timing has been argued about ever since. The charge made by Labour MP Tam Dalyell and pursued across years of parliamentary questions was that the Thatcher government sank the Belgrano specifically to destroy the prospect of a negotiated settlement. Declassified cabinet papers and the Thatcher Foundation archive confirm that the War Cabinet didn't know about the Peruvian proposals at the time the order was given. The formal announcement came after the attack. That much is on the record. But the files don't fully close the question. The precise chronology of earlier informal diplomatic contacts, whether any preliminary signal about a Peruvian framework had reached London before the War Cabinet met at Chequers, sits in the part of the archive that hasn't been released. Researchers working on this conflict, including the team behind this script, hit the same wall. The full Thatcher decision chain, the complete War Cabinet minutes, the intelligence assessments feeding into that Sunday morning meeting. Those documents remain classified under UK National Archives rules. So the Peruvian question stays open. Not because the evidence points toward guilt, because the evidence simply stops, and you can't convict or acquit on a gap. That pattern repeats throughout this story, and it's worth naming directly. Every time this investigation reached a critical junction in the decision chain, the answer was the same wall. Sealed files, partially released documents, archives still pending. One commenter put it plainly: all documents from the Malvinas War aren't public. What are you hiding? The frustration isn't conspiracy thinking. The research process ran into the same obstruction. Now the prosecution case. 4 facts. They aren't in dispute. 1. The Belgrano was outside Britain's own total exclusion zone when attacked. She was 12 nautical miles beyond the boundary, at position 55 degrees 24 minutes south, 61 degrees 32 minutes west. Britain had publicly declared that zone. It was supposed to define the battlefield. 2. The Belgrano was on a heading of approximately 270 degrees at the moment of impact. Due west, away from the British task force, away from the Falkland Islands, toward the Argentine mainland. 3. The crew wasn't at battle stations. The gunners on watch were testing equipment and moving Turret 2, described as searching the horizon for possible targets. Not combat ready, not braced for engagement. 4. The Belgrano wasn't zigzagging. Zigzagging is the standard anti-submarine evasion protocol for a warship that believes it may be under threat. Its absence is read by one side of this argument as evidence that the crew felt no imminent danger, that they didn't believe themselves to be in a combat situation at that moment. Outside the zone, heading away, not at battle stations, not zigzagging. That is the prosecution's entire case, and it carries genuine weight. 323 men were killed who had no warning, no defensive posture, and no apparent reason from where they stood on that ship to believe the next minutes would end their lives. Clive Ponting, a senior civil servant in the Ministry of Defence, believed the British government had been less than honest about that heading. In 1984, he leaked documents to Tam Dalyell suggesting Parliament had been misled about the Belgrano's course. Ponting was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. A British jury acquitted him. The fact of the acquittal does not prove the underlying claim, but it tells you something about how a cross-section of the British public read the evidence at the time. The case against Thatcher's order has real substance. Hold that. Because now comes the witness you didn't expect. Captain Hector Bonzo commanded the Belgrano. He survived. He spent the years after the war on record. In post-war interviews, Bonzo said this: "It was absolutely not a war crime. It was an act of war, lamentably legal." Sit with the structure of that sentence. The victim's commanding officer, the Argentine naval captain whose ship was destroyed, whose 323 crew members died, is telling you it wasn't a war crime. He chose the word lamentably with precision. Not clearly legal, not justified, lamentably, as in regrettably, painfully, unfortunately, but legally. The law permitted it. The law does not therefore endorse it. That's not the British government speaking. That's not a British historian. That is the man who was on the bridge. And Bonzo went further. He stated in interviews that the Belgrano was manoeuvring, not sailing away from the exclusion zone, as the prosecution narrative frames it. He confirmed that he had orders, specific orders. Orders to sink any British ship he could find. The Belgrano wasn't a cruise ship that wandered into a conflict zone. She was a warship on combat patrol with an active mandate to engage British vessels. The prosecution built its case on the heading and the position. Bonzo dismantles the assumption underneath, that a westward heading in a fluid naval engagement means the threat has passed. Ships manoeuvre. Orders don't expire because your bow points west for an hour. The Belgrano had the intent, the firepower, and the orders. Wreford-Brown knew it. The legal framework supports this reading, uncomfortably so. Under international maritime law, as it stood in 1982, a declared exclusion zone in an armed conflict does not function as an absolute legal boundary. It's a warning, not a legal cordon. Academic legal analysis, including an assessment published in a peer-reviewed international law journal, concluded that Britain was within its rights under the laws of armed conflict when it sank the Belgrano. No international court has ever ruled otherwise. The word illegal in the title of this documentary is a contested characterization, not a legal verdict. No verdict of that kind has been delivered. What Bonzo gave us instead is something more honest and more unsettling than a legal ruling. The word lamentably. Legal does not mean right. Justified does not mean moral. The law can permit something that sits heavily on the conscience of everyone involved, including, it seems, the Argentine captain who told you so himself. Now, the sovereignty argument, because the Belgrano sinking does not exist in isolation. It exists at the end of a 150-year territorial dispute, and the legal moral weight shifts depending on which end of the timeline you begin reading from. Britain has administered the Falkland Islands since 1833, when it displaced an Argentine garrison. Argentina has maintained since that moment that the occupation was and remains illegal. In 1965, United Nations Resolution 2065 called on both countries to negotiate the sovereignty question, acknowledging the interests of the islanders, pointedly not using the word wishes, a distinction Argentine diplomats still note. Negotiations followed over the next several years. In 1968, a memorandum was reportedly drafted between Britain and Argentina regarding Falklands sovereignty. The Argentine government and its supporters cite this document as evidence of a British commitment to transfer sovereignty, a commitment that was subsequently abandoned under domestic political pressure. Parliamentary Hansard records from March 26, 1968, reference Falklands negotiations. But the memorandum's full text, its signatories, and its legal standing haven't been publicly confirmed by the British government. Whether it was a binding commitment or a confidential diplomatic communication is precisely the question the source record can't answer. Present it as Argentina's argument at face value. Britain, on this reading, made a commitment and walked away from it. Whether that reading is legally sustainable is a separate question, one the sealed archives would presumably clarify if they were ever opened. Against that sovereignty argument sits a counter-argument the Falkland Islanders themselves have been making for generations. In the 2013 referendum, islanders voted 1,513 to 4 to remain a British overseas territory, a margin that doesn't leave much interpretive room. The population in 1982 was approximately 1,800, almost entirely of British descent, overwhelmingly identifying as British, and not consulted before Argentina chose to resolve the sovereignty question by invasion. The principle of self-determination under international law applies to populations regardless of size. The islanders had a voice. Argentina's decision to send troops on April 2, 1982, answered the sovereignty question with force rather than with any mechanism that gave them one. This is why the war happened, and its necessary context for what three countries did next: Chile, the United States, and France. The intelligence pipeline. A Chilean commenter wrote, "I'm Chilean, and I'm aware that we spy for the British. Playing the snitch was a shame." That comment is the entry point to a dimension of this conflict that received almost no attention in standard coverage, and that files still largely sealed make difficult to verify. What is widely reported that Chile under Pinochet provided British forces with intelligence and logistical assistance during the Falklands campaign, given the mutual border disputes between Chile and Argentina that made Chilean interests align with a British victory. What is widely reported that the Reagan administration provided Britain with satellite imagery, radar data, and intelligence support, a level of material assistance that significantly enhanced British operational capability in the South Atlantic. What is widely reported that France, which had sold Argentina the AM-39 Exocet missiles used to kill 20 British sailors when HMS Sheffield was struck on May 4th, simultaneously provided British forces with technical information about those same missiles, effectively selling Argentina the weapon and Britain the countermeasure. None of this could be fully verified from declassified primary sources during the research process for this script. All three threads are reported in credible journalism and academic analysis. All three remain in the category of widely reported but not officially confirmed. The Chilean cooperation specifically has been the subject of UPI reporting from 1985. The Reagan intelligence sharing has been discussed in Falklands War histories and partially acknowledged. The French Exocet data remains the most contested of the three. The reason none of it can be confirmed cleanly is the same reason the Thatcher decision chain can't be confirmed cleanly. The files that would answer these questions remain sealed. Argentina, whose diplomatic and military position was being undermined by at least 2 and possibly 3 foreign governments simultaneously, has never received a full accounting. Whether that constitutes betrayal depends on which legal framework you apply to intelligence operations during undeclared conflicts. The word betrayal in the alternative title for this documentary is deliberately provocative. But the underlying facts, whatever their precise contours, aren't invented. What isn't disputed, Britain won. Argentina surrendered at Stanley on June 14, 1982. The Falkland Islands remained, and remain, British. The Belgrano sinking was, in the retrospective assessment of military historians, a decisive turning point. After the Belgrano went down, the Argentine Navy's surface fleet returned to port and didn't re-engage. The British task force no longer faced a two-front naval threat. The highest engagement comment in the entire audience dataset, 56 likes, read simply, "She was exactly right. Doing so effectively prevented seaborne attacks." That is a defensible military argument. The Argentine surface fleet's withdrawal after the sinking is historical fact. That argument, though, has to sit alongside the prosecution's 4 facts. Outside the zone, heading away, not at battle stations, not zigzagging. Both things are true simultaneously. The surface fleet withdrew, and the ship that was sunk had 323 men on it who died without warning in the South Atlantic. Neither truth cancels the other. One further question hangs at the far edge of this story, and it needs a caveat before it's asked. There is a claim circulating in discussions of this conflict that Thatcher had authorised contingency plans to use Polaris nuclear missiles from HMS Resolution if British aircraft carriers had been lost. Zero declassified evidence supports this claim. The Thatcher Foundation archive, the available War Cabinet records, and the academic histories of the nuclear dimension of the Falklands conflict don't confirm it. It rests, as far as this research could determine, on speculation rather than documentation. So the question is asked once and only once, and with that caveat attached. If the war had gone differently, if Hermes or Invincible had been struck by an Exocet, what thresholds were being contemplated in private? The files that would answer that question aren't open. They may never be. That pattern, the sealed file, the unanswered question, the archive that stops short of the most uncomfortable disclosure, is the defining structural feature of this entire story. Every time you follow the evidence to the room where the real decision was made, the door is locked. The Peruvian peace proposal timeline, partially confirmed, partially sealed. The intelligence pipeline, widely reported, not declassified. The 1968 memorandum, referenced in Hansard, text not publicly confirmed. The full War Cabinet minutes from May 2nd, not fully released. The nuclear threshold question, unanswerable on current evidence. The audience member who wrote, "What are you hiding?" wasn't being paranoid. The research process behind this script hit the same doors. What is on the record, fully, unambiguously, verifiably, is this. A 12,000-ton Pearl Harbor survivor, sold to Argentina in 1951, sailed into the South Atlantic in May 1982 with orders to sink British ships. She was 12 nautical miles outside Britain's declared exclusion zone, heading west, with her crew not at battle stations, when 3 Mark VIII torpedoes, designed in the same decade she was built, found her hull. 323 men died. The Belgrano sank at 4:50 in the afternoon. That evening, Peru announced a peace proposal. Margaret Thatcher personally authorized the order that morning. She never publicly expressed regret for it. The Argentine Navy withdrew its surface fleet and didn't re-engage. Britain won the war. Captain Hector Bonzo, commanding officer, gave his verdict in plain language. An act of war, lamentably legal. Not justified and correct, not a war crime. Lamentably legal. The law permitted what the conscience struggles with. That formulation, from the man who lost his ship, is the most honest sentence anyone in this story produced. The sovereignty question is unresolved. The 1968 memorandum is unverified. The intelligence pipeline is sealed. The Peruvian timing is documented but incomplete. 323 men are dead and their names are known. The Falkland Islands held a referendum in 2013 and voted to remain British by 1,513 to 4, of 1,517 votes cast. The court is adjourned. The files, for now, stay sealed. The jury, you, the comment section, the people who've been arguing about this for 40 years, hasn't returned a final verdict. Given what's been withheld, that may be the only honest outcome available. If you want more stories where the evidence is taken seriously and the verdict is left where it belongs, with you, subscribe.